Good evening, dear friends. As you probably know, we are having the second part, and it's our second step of our joint program with Garage Museum. Our program is the program of our art magazine, Khudoshestvenny Zhurnal. Garage has been supporting our edition for several years, and this season we decided to expand our collaboration and decided that each new edition should be accompanied with some interesting intellectual event which resonates with the edition that is being published. It has to have some subject relations, and the character, the main hero, will be the writer who published some article in our magazine. And I'm very happy to see so many people in this audience. And I guess if I were you, I would be happy to walk around Moscow and enjoy this beautiful weather. So I'm really happy to see you here. Perhaps it's due to the reputation of our magazine to a certain extent, and of course it's the reputation of the author and the writer, Renata Salecl, who is with us tonight. I'm very, I've been a friend of Renata. I love her very much. She is from Ljubljana, and of course it's not only our friendship that unites us, but also our joint work. The first book in the Russian language, The Transformation of Love and Hatred, was published by our art magazine. It's been sold out. We have discussed an opportunity to reprint this book. Valery Ananishvili published two more books written by Renata that she wrote later. So for Eastern European theoretician with an international reputation, it's great to have three of her books here in Russia, because they are well known for Russian readers. And I'm sure that these three books probably contributed to the fact that we are having such a big audience today. And the quality of these books demonstrated as well. I'm not going to describe all the CV of Renata. I'm sure that you can do it faster if you check Google or Wikipedia. So I'm not going to keep you waiting. I'm going to give the microphone to Renata, and she will start her lecture. I just would like to thank Anna for her excellent organization of this event. And I have to say that it wasn't easy, because she helped to organize the visit, the traveling, identifying the date, and etc. Because Renata, being an international expert and a star, has a very busy schedule. So Anna helped us to make it fit in her schedule, and it's great to have Renata here.
Thank you. Thank you, Victor. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for publishing me again in Moscow Art Magazine. And thank you, Anna, for organizing everything so well. And especially thanks, Victor, for publishing my first book in Russian. It was a great pleasure. And that book gave me also one of the biggest narcissistic pleasures in my life, because when it came out that summer, I was in France, in Paris, in an internet cafe. At that time, we still had the internet cafes. I was typing my emails, and next to me was sitting a woman and then another man. And that woman had the Russian edition of my book with her, and we started talking, and she couldn't believe, she liked the book very much, because she was at that time going through a very passionate affair. So it was a kind of a self-help book for at least one person. Today I will speak more about art and today's times of selfies. Now, let me start with Oscar Wilde, who in The Picture of Dorian Gray observed that there is only one thing in the world worse than being talked about, and that is not being talked about. Now, in times of increased surveillance, when it is hard for people not to be seen and controlled, people are increasingly complaining that they are ignored, that they are not noticed by other people or by society at large. So the ideology of neoliberalism and the social media have jointly increased the pressure on people to make themselves constantly visible and to stand out from the crowd, to excel in self-promotion and get recognized by others in the forms of, for example, online likes or shares of their posts. Also, a vast advice and coaching industry has emerged which encourages the manipulation of others and teaches people how to pursue their goals ruthlessly, and also in some way how to be visible more and more. You know, there is a whole idea that you have to be constantly visible in today's society where it is actually very hard to hide. Now, a person nowadays appears to be free to create an image, a public persona, with which she will appear likable, not only to others, but also to herself. The downside of this presumed freedom in creating one's image is, on the one hand, the demand for perfection, but on the other, the dissatisfaction, even horror, one often feels regarding one's image. Also, one encounters anxiety over how one's image is judged by others and by what Lacanian psychoanalysis calls the so-called big other, the symbolic structure. Now, Lacan famously pointed out that the big other doesn't exist, but nonetheless functions. Now, what does this mean? Now, big other basically for Lacan is the social symbolic structure we live in. It's the culture, institutions, and primarily language. However, this big other does not create a coherent whole. But the subject creates a fantasy that it is consistent in order to temporarily find some kind of, at least a temporary perception of having an identity oneself. Now, while some might feel that they are not noticed because the image doesn't appear likable enough, others have the impression that the persona that they present to the world might be admired, but innerly they feel that they are not inhabiting this persona. That's to say that they are not whom others perceive as being. So a lot of people now have this kind of a trauma that they feel that they have a persona in the world, but that they are not inhabiting the image that they are sort of presenting to the world. Neoliberalism creates constantly new problems in regard to respect, to recognition, and kind of the disregard. Put another way, neoliberalism has led enormous numbers to kind of nurture unreal ideas of what they should aspire to be as people, and many to feel that they are substandard, and that on the basis of that, they are sort of largely kind of ignored. Changes in the way people perceive themselves in today's society have, sort of kind of got even more complicated because of the kind of a virtual social setting in which we more and more live, where we have ever new sources of recognition. Now, these new sources of recognition have in their own way influenced the people's perception of themselves, and especially the question whether they are seen, whether they are acknowledged by others as who they are. Now, on the basis of these dilemmas of today's society, I would like to explore how art can help us to sort of put another angle to these dilemmas, how art can help us in a way to unpack them slightly differently. Now, let me start with the problem of a self-portrait. How to understand a self-portrait. Moreover, how to understand a self-portrait that has maybe no resemblance to the way artist actually looks like in his or her real life. In the 1970s, the neurologist MacDonald Critchley wrote about self-portraits as impostors of sort, since artists often paint images of themselves which do not resemble how they look. As a result, Critchley concluded that self-portraits do not confirm that we know ourselves better than others. Now, psychoanalysts would ask whether a painter who obsessively draws himself engages in a form of self-analysis, and how painting oneself emotionally differs from painting someone else. Now, when a painter continuously paints himself in a form that has no resemblance to how he looks, further questions emerge. Why would one name such painting self-portrait, and how do they differ from portraits of others? Psychoanalyst Helen Deutsch linked the idea of the impostor to the child's play, since playing allows children, at least temporarily, to take on an adult role. The term impostor has long been used to describe a person who presents himself as someone else. There might be a combination of motives for doing so: financial gains, social status, the fulfillment of a fantasy about oneself, an escape from the real world, or an internalized pressure. Now, equally, the steps taken by the imposter vary. While some people take the name of someone else, others fraudulently take on the symbolic insignias, diplomas, or military decorations, or boast of achievements they have not accomplished. Now, if you look at self-imposters in today's society, but also in the past, you will see that quite often they present themselves to have like a diploma. Many self-imposters, for example, are in the domain of medicine. People who have never been to the medical school, and some have practiced for decades. You know, they convinced hospitals, some are even good doctors. In Slovenia, we recently had a woman who first faked that she was a nurse, but then, you know, at another hospital, she faked that she was a doctor. And, you know, there have been many other cases around the world, also people decorating themselves with certain military insignias, although they have never been in those battles. Now, Helen Deutsch saw the reason for presenting oneself for someone else in the impostor's ego. The latter often feels devalued and guilt-ridden. Hence, I quote from Helen Deutsch, she says that he needs to usurp the name of an individual who fulfills the requirements of his own magnificent ego ideal. Now, today, however, we have a new meaning of the term impostor in the form of the so-called impostor syndrome or the impostor phenomenon. Now, this term, impostor phenomena, impostor syndrome, came into the public domain in the 70s, late 70s, when two psychologists, one is called Pauline Clance and the other one Susanne Imes, wrote about high-achieving women having the feeling that others will find out that they are a fraud, or that others will somehow see through them and recognize that they are far from, you know, what they appear on the outside. Now, this was often the idea that, especially if women became successful, they had this feeling that they are really, you know, much less competent than they look on the outside, and that very soon they will be found out that, you know, they are not as good not as accomplished, and so on. And today we are also speaking of men having this imposter syndrome. So it is people who are successful or who have found a certain kind of a status in society, who have the feeling that soon they will be discovered to be, liars, to not to be what they look to be. Now, certain women also suffer from the perspective, and today some men too, that their success is the result of a pure luck, and that consequently they do not deserve public admiration. Now, in sort of both cases of the imposter, the first type of imposter that I'm presenting myself as someone else, and the second, the idea that I will be discovered that I'm not who I appear to be, we have the problem of how a person perceives herself regarding to this Lacanian big other, the symbolic order in which I live. In the first meaning of the term impostor, we have sort of a person who has the feeling that she's fraudulently taking on, she is actually not only have a feeling, she is taking fraudulently a symbolic role of another, identity without authorization, while in the second meaning of the term, we have a perception that one is not up to the symbolic role one is inhabiting. We have the feeling that one is a fraud. While the first type of the imposter wants to be another, the second worries that she is someone who differs from the one socially recognized. When this neurologist Critchley observed that painters who paint self-portraits are impostors of sort, he hinted at the third meaning of the term, which has to do with the person presenting himself in an image that does not go together with his actual appearance. In this perception, self-portrait would be a predecessor of today's selfies, which are increasingly staged or airbrushed images that have little resemblance to how a person looks in real life. Now, while most selfies like to enhance, improve, or embellish the real image, a whole genre or even special technology exists that distorts one's image. One can therefore get an app that makes one's face look of a different age, or even preview how a face of an alcoholic changes after decades of drinking. So we can have an app which shows us, after 20 years of drinking, how we will look like. That's kind of the idea to scare us, Now, the question of how a person observes himself has long haunted psychoanalysts and artists alike. Lacan's theory of the mirror stage tries to give an insight into how a child goes through the process of observing herself in the mirror and then comes to the point of accepting that the reflection in the mirror pertains to her. Now, there is, however, a disjunction between the image in which the child observes herself and her body self-perception. The experience of the clumsy body of the little child is something the child cannot easily unite with the image she sees in the mirror. Now, Lacan stresses the importance of the social setting, especially language, for the subject's self-recognition. So for the little child to recognize herself in the mirror, what is crucial is that adults, usually the caregiver, tell her the image in the mirror is she. And it takes some time for the child to actually recognize herself. However, her clumsy body does not go together with the perfect image that she sees in the mirror, which is why the child stumbles and has a problem uniting the image and her self-perception. Now, the problem with self-recognition continues throughout the subject's life. But today, the issues people have in regard to the image are increasing. Social media, the perception that one has a choice over one's body, together with the proliferation of cosmetic surgery and ideals of body perfection, have contributed to the growing anxiety people experience in regard to their image. The subject's anxiety might be provoked not only by the prospect of having to encounter one's image in the mirror, but also with the possibility of having to create an image in the form of a self-portrait and a selfie in which we will recognize ourselves as sort of likable. Now, by doing so, by this idea of creation of the image, the subject engages still with another idea of the impostor, which involves the fabrication of one's visual identity in accordance with some imaginary concept of oneself. Now, before the emergence of selfies, self-portraits were used by some artists as a form in which to create a more or less likable image of themselves. While some decided to paint themselves because of the lack of funds to hire a model, others were drawn to self-portraits through narcissism, the desire to immortalize themselves in order to explore their emotions or even to express their political views. Now, the example here is Gustave Courbet, who in his self-portrait entitled The Wounded Man, this was from 1844-54, he worked for a long, no, this is not. Yeah. Now, Courbet worked on this image of self-portrait for a long time, almost a whole decade was the time that he was coming back to this image. And this self-portrait has been interpreted as the artist's response to the unsuccessful revolution that he supported. After the failure of this revolution, suicide appeared the only option for the revolutionary. Which is why, he sort of painted himself as he entitled it, the wounded man. Now, Craig Bush, in his analysis of the difference between self-portraits and autobiographies, observed that some painters like to present themselves as younger and more handsome than they are, while self-portraits also often depict kind of a sequence in the change of the artist's life, but they do not create an extended narration of it. And this portrait is in some way interesting. You have a guy, here who has a sword. He was obviously, wounded, but at the same time, although he was painting it for 10 years, he appears obviously, a very young man in this image. Now, Henri Toulouse-Lautrec was even more known to kind of paint himself as more perfect than he was in real life. And, for example, in this self-portrait before a mirror from 1882, he did not reveal his disability. When he painted himself, one can see in the mirror the reflection of a young man, handsome and apparently normal in all ways that are visible. Now, Francis Bacon is well known for saying that he started painting himself because people have been dying around him like flies, and he had nobody else to paint but himself. One can imagine that he could have easily used photographs of other people since his self-portraits intentionally had little resemblance to how he looked in real life. Without the title self-portrait, one would sometimes not guess that he's trying to depict himself. Michael Pepiat, he wrote very sort of important books about Bacon's life, observed in one of them that it was after the death of Bacon's on and off lover, George Dyer, in 1971, that self-portraits took the principal place among the themes of Bacon's paintings. In addition to Dyer, Bacon that same year lost his mother, Winnie. And although Bacon had suffered from painful losses before, in 1957, his friend John Minton committed suicide, and in 1962 came the death of his decade-long lover, Peter Lacey. It was after the losses that he experienced in the early 1970s that a change seems to happen in his self-perception. Pepiat suggests that the symbolic recognition that Bacon had before and the fact that he was surrounded by what he says were visually fascinating, eminently recordable friends did not impel him to record himself. So I quote from Pepiat, who says that the artist was enjoying his wave of success and popularity to the full, and nothing predisposed him to the guilt, melancholy, and loneliness, which were later to feed his great series of paintings of himself. Now, Pepiat concludes that before the artist embarked on creating the series of self-portraits, too much was happening on the outside for Bacon to dwell on himself, and he was delighted to exercise his prose at fracturing, then capturing the likeness of others. Now, it might very well be that the symbolic recognition that this artist sort of had at first worked as a kind of a shield, which allowed Bacon not to be overburdened by his own traumas. Here, we are reminded of the impostors under the first meaning of the term, especially those who take on another persona as a solution to their inner turmoil. While a person might keep searching for stability in temporary taking on symbolic identity or in strong identification with social status, social recognition is nothing one can rely on. As Lacan poignantly observed, the social symbolic system, as I said before, doesn't exist, but it nonetheless functions, but the belief that subject has in its consistency is necessary for holding the subject together. And should this fantasy that the subject has about his or her temporal consistency collapse, the subject is likely to lose the ground on which he built his identity. Now, the tension between social recognition and the subject's self-perception is played out in both first and the second meaning of the term impostor. In the first meaning, the subject searches for identity, which will give him desired recognition. Often, the impostor, however, doesn't find stability in a single assumed identity, but goes from one identity to another. So there are impostors who are constantly changing the names. They're presenting themselves, or professions, they're presenting themselves as one profession or other, and then, they're kind of constantly moving on, never finding like a real stable identity. Now, the second meaning of the impostor, the so-called impostor syndrome, fully exposes the uncertain status of symbolic identity. It is as if the subject who suffers from the syndrome actually recognizes the lack in the big other and can no longer rely on the fantasy of the consistency of his symbolic identity. In the late 50s, the psychologist Phyllis Greenacre wrote a text on imposters and artists in which she observed that many young artists have the problem of feeling like imposter, since, as she says, bearing the gift of being an artist is not easy. Later on, many artists experience that they are at least two people, the personal self and the collectively recognized creative self. Greenacre observed that these two selves are sometimes nearly as separate as they are in the impostor. The division not infrequently recognized in the use of different names. An example is the writer Mary Ann Evans, who took the pen name George Eliot, or the performance artist Stelios Arcadiou, who shortened his name into Stelarc. Or in Slovenia, we have 3 Slovenian artists who officially changed their names to Janez Janša, the name of a conservative politician whose politics they oppose. Now, Bacon's turn to self-portraits can be read as an annihilation of the divide between the personal self and the publicly recognized self. In his self-portraits, the most intimate suddenly appears public. The intimate, however, is nothing the viewer can easily put into words or discern in the form of a recognizable image. Observing Bacon's self-portraits, the viewer has the impression that the faces are half rotten or the holes in them render them inhuman. The viewer often feels pulled into the holes. The fact that Bacon's self-portraits often involve circular gestures where the face appears like a vortex gives the impression that the viewer's gaze is sucked into this emptiness which is at the tip of the vortex. In the language of Lacanian psychoanalysis, this vortex would be close to the concept of the drive. The aim, the push that drives the subject and often undermines his conscious self-perception. It is what is the place of the real, the lack that escapes the symbolic and which the imaginary cannot depict. As a result, in many of the self-portraits, Bacon presents himself as monstrous. Now, this image of the self-portrait is from 1963. It is called A Study for Self-Portrait. Here, as you can see, we have a person seated on a curved dark blue sofa. He's dressed in a white shirt and dark gray trousers. Next, we have what looks like a kind of pieces of white paper. The person appears to be resting on a couch with his feet on the table where there are also ashtrays to be visible. Now, the face of this person is completely distorted, and the head seems to be full of dark holes. One is kind of observing like an alien creature. There appears also to be no division between the head and the body. As a result, the head looks like an externalized wound which protrudes out of the torso. Observing this distorted creature, one has the feeling that one's gaze is swallowed by the opening in the head. The hole at the place where the imaginary one imagines the eyes in the head and where the mouth is usually positioned are joined by another hole which looks like an opening in the neck. Now, why is it that Bacon so radically distorts his face? In an interview with David Sylvester, he remarks, quote, "I loathe my face. One of the nicest things that Cocteau said was," quote from Cocteau, "each day in the mirror I watch death at work," end of quote. This is what one does to oneself. Now, this statement seems to reflect on the fact that in one's face that one observes in the mirror, the seeds of the future decomposition are already present. However, when Bacon says that one does that to oneself, he also hints at the subjective inscription that is at work in one's push towards death. A person seems to observe death in the mirror, which is, however, of his own making. Now, one is reminded here of another of Cocteau's observation about death, which he states in the conclusion of his famous novel, Thomas the Impostor. In this story, the main character, the young soldier, Guillaume Thomas, pretends all his life that he is someone else, and his pretense does not stop even when he dies. In the final battle, and I quote from Cocteau, he says, "As he heard no fire, he stopped," Guillaume Thomas, he stopped and turned around out of breath. Then he felt a stick strike him violently on the chest. He became deaf and blind. A bullet. "I haven't a chance if I don't pretend to be deaf," he said to himself. But in him, make-believe and reality were one. Guillaume Thomas was death. End of quote. If the meaning of this, that even in death the impostor has the power to go on pretending, is the meaning of this, that even in death the impostor has the power to go on pretending. Even if this time he cannot do anything but play at being what he is, death. Or is it maybe the observer, the narrator, who looks at the death impostor and sees double, both a death man and one playing another of his tricks? Now, when artists focus incessantly a lot on death, the first impression is that they are expressing their own anxiety over death, or mourning loved ones, or both. Depiction of death can, however, be an attempt to make death itself visible, in the endeavor to master one's anxiety over it. One example is the Mexican photographer Enrique Metenides. Now, Enrique Metenides became famous capturing tragic scenes, car crashes, train derailments, street stabbings and shootings, accidental explosions, suicide, manslaughters. Metenides was a photographer for a kind of a yellow Mexican newspaper, La Prensa, for 40 years. He worked there since he was a teenager. Now, he first shot an accident when he was 12 years old, when his father had a corner shop where he was often spending time during the day, and father gave him for birthday the first camera. And whenever an accident, and there were lots of accidents happening at that corner, happened, little Metenides would jump out of the shop and take a photo of that accident. So when he was 14 years old, he got the first job as the photographer of accidents for this newspaper. He worked throughout his life, running from one accident to another, established even a kind of a special system which helped the ambulance know where the accident happened. So he was often first at the scene of the accident to photograph it, and then he would kind of inform the ambulance. Now, throughout his life, he put out thousands of images of accidents, and this is one of the most kind of famous one. And when he retired, by coincidence, one curator of the Museum of Art in Mexico City found these photos. She then convinced Metenides to allow her to show these photos in an art space. And at that moment, when he was a retired newspaper photographer, he became famous as an artist. He never planned to be an artist. Now, later, he became obsessed. He's so obsessed of dying in himself that he's still recording, all the accidents. But, now he's kind of living in an apartment, never traveling. And with televisions, he's recording what is happening all around the globe, the catastrophes, whatever is happening that has kind of death and, the end of the world, and yet Metenides would record. Now, Metenides often showed how these tragic events were reflected through the eyes of observers, which is why some of his other photographs show, the image of the accidents in the eyes of the observers, how the observers observed accidents. Now, in the numerous photographs, he focused on these witnesses of traumatic scenes, as well as showing how dead people look like in these images. Now, Metenides was in his youth very much affected by films, wanting to record how the eye of the observer functions like a mirror in which the scene of the accident would be visible and potentially recorded. When he later became a photographer, his passion for depicting what death looks like was an attempt to create a distance between the event and the presentation. Metenides' photos present death as a curiosity which does not seem anxiety-provoking. In some of his images, we even have the impression that dead people are still alive. When you look at this image of this beautiful woman, at first you have, problem thinking, is this really a dead person? And of course, I wrote another text about Metenides where, when I looked at his interview, I observed that throughout his life, he has been afraid of his own death, which is why depicting death is for him something that appeases his own anxiety, and what he's also very afraid is to be buried alive. And that's quite often an obsessional fear one observes also with other neurotic kind of anxieties in regard to death. Now, with Francis Bacon, too, death seems in a strange way appeased, tamed, and sometimes non-death. In his study for a portrait number 2, after the life mask of William Blake, this is from 1955, one has the impression that it is an image of a person asleep. There is a hint of pink color in the face in midst of many layers of paint, which makes the portrait look strangely alive. One does not imagine that the one is looking at the mask of a dead person, but it's someone who maybe is resting at the moment and might maybe wake up. Now, during the same period that he produced this image, Bacon was engaged with self-portraits for the first time. So actually the first self-portrait he did in 1955 when he was at the same time working on a portrait of Vincent van Gogh. Bacon found in Van Gogh's art a stimulus for developing his own take on the relationship between reality and fiction. As he says in an interview with David Sylvester, I quote, "I believe that realism has to be reinvented. It has to be continuously reinvented." In one of his letters, Van Gogh speaks of the need to make changes in reality, which becomes lies that are truer than the literary truth. This is the only possible way the painter can bring back the intensity of the reality which he is trying to capture. One believes that reality in art is something profoundly artificial, in that it has to be recreated. Otherwise, it will be just an illustration of something, which will be very second-hand, end of quote. Now, Bacon exemplifies this by pointing out how surprised he was to visit the landscapes in Provence that Van Gogh had painted in vivid colors, creating a marvelous vision of the reality of things, which in reality, didn't look like this. So Bacon was shocked that when he visited Provence, he observed that the country was actually barren. It was the paint that gave it its amazing life. Now, Bacon similarly approaches the portraits. Here, too, he challenges the reality of one's appearance. In many of his interviews, Bacon stresses that he detested if portraits resembled a person being painted. Bacon explains his technique of painting portraits as trying to depict what emanates from the person. It is the energy within the appearance that he wants to capture. As a result, he found it most challenging to find a way to present in his portraits the pulsation of a person that was painted. Also, it was crucial for him to find subjects that absorbed him completely, since, as he says, without some subjects, one might just go back to decoration. Now, Bacon tried to capture the energy of the person he was painting, but he also in some way dealt with his persona and what emanated from him as a painter. And he explains this to Sylvester by saying, "I work in a kind of a haze. I don't want the work to be hazy, but I work in a kind of a haze of sensations and feelings and ideas that come to me and that I try to crystallize." Now, this haze of sensations and feelings gave life to Bacon's portraits and self-portraits, which, like Van Gogh's colors, brought out something else from the person being depicted, something other than the reality of his appearance. Now, when we observe the portraits of Bacon's friends, we get the impression that they uncannily resemble their subjects, while they expose something in reality of the image that goes beyond representation. Catching the likeness of Bacon's subject was about depicting both characteristics as well as moments when the subjects move and change. Bacon saw his own friends in a kind of a film sequence, which is always moving. It is something unrecognizable from one sequence to another. So in portraits, he tried to capture these moments and the aura of a person, as well as presenting that person in such a way that he makes visible certain characteristics which were not bound by specific circumstances. As Pepiat notes, without those drives and contradictions, which were in a sense inner architecture of appearance, he believed the portrait became banal, empty illustration. Now, one wonders how Bacon would try to convey these feelings in today's times when all kinds of new technologies allow artists and also ordinary people to share their perception with others. For example, through all kinds of new technologies, Facebook, Twitter, and especially Instagram. Now, numerous people today use Instagram as a platform that allows them to create a new gallery space, which is kind of a space where they curate their lives, often using a mixture of techniques, photos, paintings, computer-generated images, as well as short texts and hashtags. Some artists exhibit now only in this new space, and others suddenly become artists because this new forum provides social recognition. Now, this happened to an Italian-British architect named Ranieri Fontana Giusti, who, when being diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, turned to art and posted daily on Instagram his painting, artistic photos, and occasionally family photos, all to convey to the anonymous public his torment related to his incurable illness. Amid this collage of images, Fontana Giusti placed his self-portraits. So here we can see actually two. One is the first, the selfie with the kind of a face hidden, and this is the selfie sort of like after one of the chemo therapies. Now, some in other images are also self-portraits drawn by pencil. Some were kind of images of his deteriorated body, and so on. The mixture of these images conveyed the feeling of wonder about life, anxiety over death, as well as optimism when the illness was not progressing. At the same time, hashtags to the images added their interpretation. So many images, they had like the hashtags like end of conventional medicine, depression, cancer heads, hanging on, and similar. From these hashtags, one can easily get the additional impression about the feelings that incited some of the artwork. Now, while some people turn to Instagram to express their painful feelings, others use this platform as a place where they curate an image of themselves in the way they would like to appear to the outside world and hopefully be admired. So Instagram and similar networks offer a space where a person hopes to get symbolic recognition, while it also presents a new type of mirror in which one observes oneself and in which one is constantly observed by others. However, even more importantly, these new social spaces allow everyone to become an impostor. On the internet, one can easily present oneself in an idealized image. One can appropriate another's identity or fabricate symbolic insignia. Now, in this new world of images, aggression is often very much part of how people interact among themselves, as well as how they react towards themselves, which is why, unsurprisingly, the second meaning of the term imposter, the imposter syndrome, is on the rise. In the space where criticism is ever present, people easily internalize these attacks and start criticizing themselves. Reflecting on this uneasiness people experience in regard to their image, a whole new genre of art selfies has appeared today. Now, these art selfies do not show the face of a person taking selfie realistically. Here is an image of the Hong Kong-based art writer, Jaclyn Tong, who only shares selfies of her face, which are obscured by the photo taking the image. So her idea is that she's taking numerous selfies, but never showing herself, in a way, only the back of the photo. She explains this by saying, "I don't like my face. It is boring. That's why I put myself behind the phone." Now, this statement is similar to Bacon's remark about hating his face. And strangely, the phone, with the help of which Tong takes her self-portrait, creates a lack in her image, which seems a new version of a whole Bacon was playing with in his time. Now, also with the first selfie that Fontana Giusti was doing, it appears as if, there was a phone in his head, but like it was kind of scratched. This is the first image there, which kind of reminded me of this one. Now, social media today presents a space where voyeurism is played out in a new way. While people are highly critical of each other, they also experience unease about their own image. Many people who observe images of others on Instagram feel terrible about their own bodies, while those who post their personal images experience even more negative feelings about themselves. And there have been research which shows that women who observe other women on Instagram often feel terrible about themselves. But those women who post their own images feel even more terrible. Now, if it is observing a selfie of others and posting one's own kind of so traumatic, we can say that we find here kind of new forms of sadism and masochism. The question of how one looks in the eyes of anonymous others on the internet, which functions as this kind of a new form of the big other today, is also reshaping the old impostor syndrome. Now, as well as the subject feeling that she will be found out or is falling short in regard to the symbolic image, that she's not good enough, and so on, the person is also dealing with her image not being up to the presumed ideals. Now, jouissance in voyeurism and criticism that are today part of the new media, however, are not so much different from the kind of a criticism that Bacon engaged in his own time. Bacon was known to relentlessly criticize other artists, especially well-known artists. There were very few he occasionally praised. Now, Pepiat mentions that there was a kind of a repetitive rhythm of Bacon's conversations, especially when he was under the influence of alcohol, when he made unguarded remarks about himself, his experiences, and was constantly denigrating other famous artists. It was a quote, "It was a process of stripping away to see what, if anything, would remain after he continued verbal assaults. The tone, like his approach to painting, was often provocative and aggressive, and there were very few people and themes that escaped this scrutiny unscattered." Now, like today's internet voyeur, Bacon found particular stimulation in voyeuristic observations of the emotional distress of other people. After being alone in the studio, the artist loved to go out, meet his friends, and observe others, particularly when they were in the grips of intense emotions or undergoing a crisis. So he would often sit in the restaurant near a mirror so that he could watch discreetly what he called people carrying on. So he would observe them in the mirror how other people were sort of having fights or some emotional crisis or so on. What especially excited Bacon was the observation of sexual jealousy. When, for example, he had a chance to observe people fighting publicly with their partners. Bacon's portraits seem to reflect this turmoil he observed in public spaces. Some of the portraits thus look like scenes that are kind of he's glimpsing through half-open doors, or something that kind of he's observing in the mirror. Now, he was also known for having bitter quarrels with his lovers and for his masochism. Yet observing others in emotional turmoil gave him very particular satisfaction. For him as an artist, it was, however, not enough to try to depict this turmoil in the painting. He was particularly impelled to inflict pain onto others via paintings he produced of them. However, by doing this, he was channeling his pain to the process of painting. This was especially the case when he painted friends who died. Dead friends are brought back with the help of painting. Bacon explains this by saying, I quote, "If they were sitting in front of me, they would inhibit me, or I couldn't practice on them the injury I inflict in my work. I like to be alone in the way I remember them, and then I hope to bring them back more poignantly and violently." End of quote. Bacon liked observing people in mirrors, as I said, in public spaces, but he also liked to play with mirrors in his work. However, when he depicted mirrors in his paintings, we often do not see the reflection of the surface in the mirror, but often something else. Now, often the mirror that he places in the images does not in some way reflect how the person actually looks. It appears as if another image. So here we have the mirror in the self-portrait. We see a male figure seated in front of a, sorry, that's kind of another one. This is his self-portrait, where he's sitting in front of the wash basin, but behind we have, something that looks like a kind of a mirror, but it can also be that the doors are opened and, we are observing something. One wonders here whether is the artist observing himself, is it like a super ego gaze that looks at the artist who is vomiting into the wash basin, while there is a light hanging from the ceiling which looks like an interrogation light and casts a strange shadow on the wall. Now, because Bacon likes to use images, the mirrors, and kind of likes to observe other people's dramas, one also wonders here whether he's kind of a voyeur of his own suffering in images like this, whether he observes here his own suffering via the intermediary in the mirror. Now, in psychoanalysis, the mirror is often mentioned in two ways. First, mirror is the reflective surface with the help of which the subject goes through the process of self-recognition. But the second is the mirror is the anxiety-provoking gaze of the double. Lacan, on top of talking about the mirror stage, speaks about the role of the mirror, precisely here the role the mirror plays in anxiety. The subject, observing himself in the mirror, might have a moment of anxiety, an uncanny feeling that from the mirror someone is observing him, that there is a double in some way emerging in the mirror that is returning the gaze to the subject. Now, in Bacon's portraits and self-portraits, however, the mirror does not play that kind of anxiety-provoking role, but I would even say plays strangely appeasing role. It is as if the horrifying gaze is present in the distorted faces, which are cut up, full of dark holes, and the uncanny gaze in his portraits is coming, from the elements in the portraits, while, it appears as if, it is not coming, from the person looking himself in the mirror. Now, a different experience with the gaze related to portraits is at work in the exhibition called Danger Museum, which was done by Russian artists Vladimir Dubasarsky and Alexander Vinogradov, and it was part of the Venice Biennial in 2009. The Russian duo created an exhibition full of paintings of famous people and classics from the artwork, among them Rembrandt, Joseph Beuys, even Barack Obama. Now, in some paintings, the faces of contemporary figures were superimposed onto reproductions of old masters. But in the case of this image of Rembrandt, we have the artist kind of combining reproductions of all Rembrandt's self-portraits into one giant painting. Observing the replicas of these historical portraits, the viewer was invited to guess what was changed in the old paintings, or which historical figure was replaced by a contemporary one. However, at the end of this exhibition, when you walked through the exhibition, you were invited into a special room, where you would see full of kind of many television screens, where you could see that actually it was the paintings which were observing you. So in the last room of the exhibition were television screens where you would see yourself standing in front of the painting. Now, this was a very uncanny moment, and when you came there was obviously a delay in the portraits, in the eyes, and elsewhere in the portraits there were hidden cameras from which the portrait was observing you. What I observed happening at that exhibition was that many people, when they saw themselves recorded by the portraits, went back and see the exhibition one more time. And they were standing, in front of the portrait, sometimes searching for where was the camera, but also wanting to look better, so that they would have a better image at the end, So they were trying in some way to pose in an admirable way. Now, when Bacon speaks about his portraits, he often also speaks about the question of what is behind the image. And as a result, his portraits often have been analyzed in the context of the difference between the face and the mask. Hans Belting, in his interpretation, said that he sees Bacon's portraits of his friends and models as an attempt to make the mask alive. Instead of searching sort of a kind of a similarity between the model and the portrait, in a way, Bacon tries to enliven the portrait and gives it the impression that of a kind of a form of a life. Now, Gilles Deleuze, in contrast, does not see the mask as what covers the face, but as something that is the face itself. So for Deleuze, Bacon was not painter of faces, but rather heads. With his techniques of painting people's portraits, he changed, as he says, the form of portrait, liberated it from previous conventions. Violence, for example, becomes intrinsically connected to the idea of portrait. So the way Bacon reformulated the portrait in some way extended also to the surrounding of the depiction of the body or the head. Bacon, in Deleuze's perception, perceives spasms as if the body is trying to escape through one of its organs or rejoin the flat-tinted area around it. As a result, for Deleuze, the shadows which are present in Bacon's work play as much as a role as kind of the body that he's depicting. For Parveen Adams, what escapes through the body in Bacon's painting is libido, lamella, or the organ of the drive. Now, these kind of interpretations of Bacon's work, often kind of speak about the kind of the hysteria. So Deleuze links Bacon's work with hysteria, not that he's trying to analyze the painter, but rather kind of links the way he paints with kind of a hysterical practice. He says that painting in this case directly attempts to release the presence beneath representation beyond representation. Now, these invisible forces which kind of strike the side of heads, for the viewer who observes them in a gallery often are supplanted by another type of the image, the reflection of the viewer herself in the painting. Now, the important part was that Bacon covered his paintings always with the glass. Oil paintings, but he put glass on top of it as a kind of a reflective surface in which the viewer could observe herself. Now, this was noticed by a patient of the British psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott, who at one of her sessions described her feelings after she saw an exhibition of Bacon's work. And she was obsessing in her psychoanalytic session about the glass that was covering the paintings. Winnicott commented in the footnote to the patient reflection that Bacon's preference for putting glass on top of the painting is related to the dependence on chance in the painter's life. His idea was that this preference for glass is due to the fact that glass set paintings somewhat apart from the environment. Just, and that the glass in some way protects. But what counts more in this case is also the belief in that artist that the kind of the play of reflection will enhance his pictures. His dark blue pictures in particular. The psychoanalyst kind of reflected that the glass enabled the spectator to see his own face also in the painting. Now, the observing oneself can be anxiety-provoking, as I said at the beginning. And let me, in conclusion, point out, how this anxiety is today often kind of played out. Italian photographer Manuel Colombo, I think, nicely kind of depicted this anxiety of observing oneself in the image. This condition is often referred to as isophobia. People who suffer from this phobia often complain that they are covering up mirrors around their in the apartments, or they're avoiding the mirrors. However, avoiding the mirrors does not prevent them to actually have horror of observing any reflection of themselves in any kind of shiny surface. So there are people who cannot see any reflection of themselves, and therefore are avoiding mirror. However, the horrible image constantly returns to them. So in this image, we can see the mirrors, but we also see the image. Actually, the person doesn't have the face, but nonetheless, the person who is standing in front, trying not to see himself, is being haunted by the perception of this horrible reflection of himself. Now, while for some anxiety-provoking can be, observing their reflection, for others, their horror might be the image himself. And, returning again, to Bacon, we can say that in some of his images, we see that kind of a horror depiction of the head, but also, an attempt to find something kind of an appeasing, something like as a solution that would hold together a distorted body. And, a mirror sometimes can be, like in this image, the portrait of Gilbert de Botton. It's kind of the mirror which appears, to show a kind of a much more perfect image of a person that we ever see in his other portraits or self-portraits. Surprisingly here, the man's face is not distorted. The image looks quite realistic. The only perturbing thing is the kind of a half scream of the opening up of the man's mouth and the dark spot on the left side of the man's chin. Now, as Andrew Benjamin points out, in this portrait, we have a reflection that both does and does not reflect. I quote, "The split head in the mirror mirrors, and yet what comes to be viewed of that which is mirrored, the head outside the mirror, is not the same as the mirrored head. There is more involved here than the splitting of the self." So The image in the mirror might very well be taken as an impostor of sort. It might be that the painter sees here an idealist version of his subject reflected in the mirror, or that he's guessing that the man he's painting sees himself as someone he's not. We don't see, how the man actually looks like. Now, a lot has changed since the time Bacon was working on his self-portraits. Some are now even talking about the end of the self-portraits. Hillel Schwartz observed the change in self-portraits already evident at the end of the 20th century. I quote, he says, "Our self-portraits seem neither to anchor nor to extend. Why? Perhaps because of the fury of acceleration and the fatigue of deacceleration felt in each century's end, and most deeply in our 90s, that was previous century, that this kind of moment makes us desperate for new bodies, perhaps because our likeness is sort of as fragmented as our lives. Perhaps our false intimacies lash out on to narcissism, perhaps because in the middle of all the electronic spectacles, all we can make of ourselves is suspect. Perhaps the best we can manage in a world of simulacra is a visage unavoidably generic." End of quote. Now, in the 21st century, selfies are following even more closely the ideals of generic images, which is why they are contributing to the continuous extinction of self-portraits from the past. Anxiety over how people appear in public is amplified in times when one's image appears a matter of choice, which is why the desire to look like someone else, that is, to become a visual impostor, has never been greater. Now, Bacon, in his questioning of realism, might at first appear as someone enchanted by the idea of the impostor. However, the distractions he engaged in with his paintings, the cracks and lags which dominate his portraits, expose the shaky grounds which are behind the impostor's desire to hold onto a symbolic position and to create an image which will uphold it. At the end of her study on the impostor, Helen Deutsch pessimistically concludes that the more she was researching this theme, the more she started seeing impostors everywhere, in her friends and acquaintances, and even in herself. Everyone seems to fabricate their identity in accordance with some imaginary concept of self. Deutsch questions whether there is a difference between the normal and the pathological impostor, and whether the identity between the ego ideal and the self is actually achieved only by saints, geniuses, and psychotics. Quote from her, "As one's ego ideal can never be completely gratified from within, we direct our demands to the external world, pretending that we actually are who we would like to be." End of quote. Now, great art exposes the futile attempts of such pretending. While Deutsch is right to see elements of imposture in everyone, the problem is not that people pretend that they are whom they would like to be, but that they are constantly guessing whom they would like to be and which of their images might actually be socially desirable. As a result, painters in the past often experimented with different self-portraits, in the way that today people take selfie after selfie, never finding the real image. Thank you.
Дорогие друзья, если у кого-то есть вопрос, пожалуйста, поднимите руку, мы передадим микрофон.
Dear friends, if you have any questions, please raise your hand and we'll pass a mic over to you.
Спасибо вам за лекцию. Скажите, пожалуйста,
Thank you very much for your lecture.
с чем связан вообще феномен селфи, если это понятно?
Why do you think this phenomenon of selfie appeared? Of course, such social media as Instagram, Facebook do it deliberately, and there is an algorithm. So why do you think they came up with this technology? Why did it appear?
Oh, thank you for this question. That's a very interesting question. I think that probably it has been a big surprise for the sort of kind of creators of this technology, especially the creators of the phones, that selfies become so popular. I doubt that they imagined at first that it would be such huge success, because what reminds me that often what we expect does not realize itself. Here, what I'm reminded of another technology which actually failed, and that was, when text messages were first sort of established, phones with the capacity for text messages. I met at that time creators of video phones. Already at that time the idea was that very soon people will not want to write messages, but will only want to kind of observe each other. Now, at that moment, in the early times, the technology actually did not take on in such way, because people continued actually using text messages, which they still do with the capacity, of Skype or WhatsApp, or all kinds of technologies where we can see each other. Quite often, we actually do not want to see another and don't want to kind of be seen. Why? Because text messages actually allow much more of a space for fantasy than exchange of images does. Especially, let's say, if you look at falling in love, text messages allow for interpretation, for fantasy, for romanticizing, for reading in them all kinds of things that are not written there, where the images would not. So the text messages are, quite essential, in kind of keeping self-delusions also alive, and which is why I think that. On top of wanting to share our images, we also have moments where we want to close our eyes in front of images of others and also not to be seen.
Еще вопросы?
Вы сказали, вы упомянули концепт Лакана.
You mentioned Jacques Lacan and his concept of mirror.
Восприятие, вернее, так сказать, тревогу человека в отношении
And
восприятия его.
you talked about anxiety and the anxiety that person has from the big other point of view. So, can we say that when Instagram appeared, this big other changed somehow? Maybe a different institution appeared, a different kind of big other appeared. Or maybe there are two big others now that sort of join each other. We can say that on the Instagram people are trying to have some image. They claim a certain image that is not in line with reality, and we can see many people on the Instagram and they exchange their comments. So they can recognize that the other looks the way they present themselves. So this exchange of recognition, so to say, removes anxiety to a certain extent. Or maybe affected such movement as body positive movement and others.
Thank you for your question. Yes, I agree that Instagram presents a new version of the big other, but we still have a big other. So I don't subscribe to the pessimistic theory of some French psychoanalysts which are speaking about the end of the big other or the kind of a psychotization of society. I don't think so. I think that we are still very firmly, in dealing with the social setting. It is just changed. So already 20 years ago, two French psychoanalysts, Jaclyn Tong and Eric Laurent, wrote about the changes in the big other. Their idea was that the traditional form of the big other, which was linked to traditional authorities like father figures, religious figures, state figures, or whatever, ceased working in the way that we have a new others, like especially they mentioned committees. Whenever we have a problem now, we establish a committee. We still have a problem, but then at least we have a committee. It's like kind of a new symbolic structure. There were other theories who were speaking about the plural of others. However, I think that this idea that a person has, that there is a social symbolic structure at work, and that the fantasy that it is somehow coherent, is often still part of how the subjectivity tries to imagine the social space around. And Instagram, Facebook, all this, the regime of social media and the internet, I think, have contributed to a new form of self-perceptions, which is, again, not so different. Like in my book on choice, I have made an analysis of this change in how people perceive themselves in the online forums. I take the example here of women who have problems with overspending, who create an online community trying to, every night report to this forum how much they have spent during the day, and, be kind of accountable, change their habits. Now, when women overspend during the day, they felt terribly guilty in the evening in front of this new authority, which they created. They didn't know these other people. Maybe they were not even people. Maybe they were bots, maybe they were, someone faking to be a human. In times of artificial intelligence, it can be. But the feeling of guilt was as if they are reporting to an authority, which is why I think that self-perception is continuing to be traumatic, but in a new setting. And I'm just now working on this kind of question of what changed with subjectivity today is what I'm sort of researching now, which is why I started reading about this research on Instagram, on self-perception, and so on. And for me, it was interesting to observe that this kind of neurotic symptoms are quite similar as they were before. And when I speak with psychoanalysts, they also observe this, that people's symptoms in some way, yes, have shifted in a little bit new direction. The complaints are, maybe slightly different, but nonetheless, there is not such a huge turn away from the kind of a classical dilemmas of, who am I? What do I want? Which are kind of the neurotic questions. How am I regarded by others? Now it's the Instagram or Facebook, but with the invention of likes, these likes that people are getting, the anxiety is quite high, and anger if you don't get the lights, and quite often the identity the temporary identity you have might be temporarily linked on how many people are following you, which is why to keep my anxiety on check, I'm not on any of the Facebooks and Instagrams, although I understand that, there are professions where actually you cannot be without them.
Кстати говоря, по поводу лайков,
Speaking about likes,
если я не
by the way.
ошибаюсь, у Лакана
if I'm not mistaken, Jacques Lacan, when he wrote about his concept of mirror, it was a metaphorical image, and he meant, he didn't mean the visual image, he meant the image that a person recognized in the language, in the verbal communication. So maybe like is not a very reliable method to get rid of anxiety. And actually, the way communication changed when we have less verbal component, when there are more likes and visual images. So how does it influence anxiety and self-perception?
Yes, that's a very important question because, actually psychoanalysts do observe, and not only psychoanalysts, also, psychologists and others, that like with little children, when they are introduced very early on to the, kind of machines, the screens, quite often there is kind of a moment where they, have to deal with kind of reality in a new way. There have been little children observed that, when they don't like something in reality, they are swiping. They want to get away this image because they are so used of swiping and changing, the images on the machinery. And I absolutely agree with you, the importance of the oral component, which actually for Lacan, is linked to the symbolic, which is why when he speaks about the mirror stage, he says that the symbolic, is prior to the imaginary. It is the primary caregiver, the voice of the primary caregiver who, in an important way introduces the image to the child, so which is why that the child is already in advance in language in the social setting. Now, whether, children, who don't have that much of interaction, like physical and oral introduction in early childhood suffer, I think we can guess that there is definitely, a certain change and, probably also a loss if the child, is not in a kind of an interaction, but mostly, in a kind of a family where everyone is glued to the machinery, which is now quite a typical scene of how, families, and not only families, function.
Друзья, нас уже немножко поджимает время,
Dear friends, I'm afraid we are running out of time.
Скажите, а почему
I would
вы
like to ask
не
you one more
упомянули ни
question.
одного портрета женщины?
Why
У
didn't
женщины
you
может быть
mention
автопортрет?
any portrait of a woman? Because women could have self-portraits.
Thank you so much. I think this is a fantastic question, which requires that I write a new lecture precisely on this subject. And thank you for a very feminist conclusion and a rightful criticism. Thanks.
Thank you.